Yeah. Friends, it is time for a good old First Parish dialogue sermon. We love a good dialogue sermon here.
Taking a moment to get our mics attached to our ears.
I think we're good.
Yeah. Any thumbs up, thumbs down? Anyone having trouble with the audio? Great.
See thumbs up.
Good. We love that. So that reading.
Yeah.
When you picked that reading, and I read it, I just needed to sit for a second and take it in. And I think that I was really interested in us taking a moment to share how unfortunately familiar that feeling is of having someone express something that you know is love, but it actually hurts because it's this criticism, this preemptive criticism of what you're going to face out in the world.
Yeah.
So what do you want to tell us about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I resonated so strongly with that reading, not because I had that exact experience, but because I have always been fat. I am what is often called in the fat liberation community small fat. So I'm just over the edge of straight size. But when I was a kid and growing up, I was told I was big boned. I was told I was chubby or all sorts of other things, bigger, fluffier. People used euphemisms to talk around it and to try to convince me or to convince themselves that I wasn't fat. And that came from this place of love, that fat was a thing that would hurt me if I was fat, that other people would have things to say about it. And so people would try to talk around it or move away from the idea that I was fat.
Yeah, and when you talk about that, it, connects to experiences that I think I've had, that I've seen other people have who, we might have had those responses to coming out as trans or sharing with family members a really challenging health diagnosis, is that the first thing they think, and I've, had loved ones say this to me, that they're worried because they know that bad things happen to people who have this label. And I've unfortunately also had, friends who are chronically ill who, have loved ones who get worried about them forgetting the diagnosis, even though they already had the problem.
Right.
And it, makes me think about what it means to euphemize things, and like the fact that we get a lot of liberatory power out of saying things that are true and saying that without shame, saying it as not a bad thing to say.
Right. I, as someone who is also short, I think a lot about how if I say I'm short, people don't say, no, you're not short. You're beautiful.
You're differently tall.
Tall and beautiful, and you have worth. No one says that to me, because in our society, mostly it's okay to be short, right? So we don't have to go into these weird places when we talk about how someone is short or any number of other things. But when I say I'm fat, I'm just naming a thing that is true about myself and about my body, just like when I say I'm short or I say I have curly hair. And it just feels really important to name that and to accept that. I think there's been some push to reclaim the word fat, as sometimes there are with words that have become slurs. But I think even beyond that, fat is just a descriptor about our bodies, the same way many, many other words are descriptors. And so it felt important to Soren and I in this service to use that word and to name that word as just a word that is how people can and do talk about their bodies.
Yeah, and I think that also when I'm thinking about just things that are already true about how we're existing in our bodies and existing in our lives, if we're trying to find liberation from meeting ourselves where we are, describing the fact of adipose tissue cells is like not, it's real, it's there, like we can't, act like it's not. And I think that also the idea that there has to be positivity around it is not the same thing as liberation. Like the body positivity narrative in general that has become really popularized lately, and I think is something that people are talking about more, is not necessarily the same thing as just saying, this is what's already true and I already want to be free about it.
Yeah. Something, Soren, that you said to me when we were talking about this service is that positivity is this mindset, this way that we approach things, and liberation is, it's a way of being, and it's a collective project. And so This is a service about fat liberation because we use the word fat as a word that means a thing, and liberation because that is the work that we do here together in this place, right? We get together for liberation in all sorts of ways. And one of those is fat liberation and bodies and how we think and talk about them.
Mhm. Well, and so when we were talking about this service, we also spent a lot of time getting really excited about a podcast that we have a shared love of, which is a podcast called Maintenance Phase. I actually do credit you, Reverend Aisha, with getting me into this podcast, and now no one can get me out of it. I am listening to it all the time. I rearranged my entire living room listening to information about some diet where someone ate only beef for like 6 months.
Carnivore diet.
So now when I look around at my living room furniture, there it is, just a memory. Someone did that.
Yeah, and Maintenance Phase is this podcast about, it's about weight and diet and all sorts of things in society. And in it, the hosts, Aubrey Gordon and Michael Hobbs, they do this deep dive research, and they're often hilarious, talking about fact checking, debunking popular wellness trends, diet trends, celery juice and Goop, the Gwyneth Paltrow product, family of products, and all sorts of things.
Mhm.
And Aubrey recently released a book, I have it here, it's called You Just Need to Lose Weight and 19 Other Myths About Fat People, which I also just love to also point out was published by Beacon Press, which is our UU outward facing printing press. I believe her first book was also. But we read this and started diving in, and then stopped at the first chapter and said, that will be enough for us to talk about in the service.
And I think that that's one of the things that, motivated this service and also motivated really centering it around a specific portion of our UU values is that once you start digging into stuff like this, like listening to this podcast or this book, they're so well researched. Like they are so nerdy. I love it. There's so much really like well-cited evidence and really a wealth of perspectives from the literature review about what's going on. And I love hearing from people who have a lived experience and also a lot of data. It's really, really delightful. And so I think like reading this first chapter of the book was incredibly hard hitting. Also one of those things that really gave me pause by the end and left me with a lot to consider emotionally. And so, we had some strong reactions and you were going to talk us through a little bit of that first chapter.
So each chapter of this book addresses a myth about fat people and fatness. And then Aubrey does her lived experience, deeply researched, deep dive into debunking that myth. And so in the very first chapter, the myth is being fat is a choice. If fat people don't like how they're treated, they should just lose weight. And there's a lot in this chapter. It's, only like 10 pages, but there's a lot crammed in there. But at the very end, she shares this anecdote and reflection that just like really, really stopped me and had me think about it. So I'm going to summarize it for you. So she talks about at the end of the book, she's gone through all these things about, fatness and choice and weight loss. And then she says, but let's for a moment think and believe that dieting works the way we've been led to believe that it works, and that intentional weight loss in all its forms is possible. And let's also presume in this moment that the BMI, the body mass index, is a real thing that has value, which I could
meaning for individual healthcare.
Talk about Sermon, but the basics of that is that it's based on the numbers, the weights and heights of white men in the 60s. And is used to predict things about all sorts of people's bodies. That is just, there's a whole episode about that. You could, I'm going to restrain myself in this moment. But even if the BMI was real and that's what we wanted to be projecting on, and even if intentional weight loss was possible the way we talk about it, Aubrey says that, so if she wanted to lose weight and be a BMI healthy weight, right, that would take her 3 years if she did it in the way that was safe, because medical providers say we should only lose about 1 or 2 pounds a week. So for her to get from her current weight to her BMI healthy weight at her height, on that scale would take her 3 years. And so she says, even if it was possible for me to just lose weight, which is a big even if, she said it would take 3 years to do it right. And for those 3 years, she would just get treated in the awful way that she gets treated. She says, whether intentionally or unintentionally, just lose weight tells fat people that we will only be worth hearing out once we do something that's all but impossible. Become thin. And then she talks about advocacy. She says, when someone tells me to just lose weight, it teaches me that I cannot expect their advocacy. Really illuminates for me this thing that advocacy, what we talk about as advocacy, is sometimes really just asking people who have a form of discrimination or oppression forced upon them to meet someone else's benchmarks, and then they can be worthy, right? She says none of us should have to change our appearance in order to earn basic respect and dignity. And just the way she walks through this story of, all right, even if I could do that, it would still take 3 years before I was in the category that is apparently allowed to have worth and dignity.
Yeah. And that's already honestly enough to sit with. Having also read the chapter myself, I found it really moving that in the middle, this is again like 2 out of 10 pages in the chapter, Aubrey really grabbed a topic that resonates very close to my experience, because she brought up the parallels to this idea of what if it is a choice, and does it matter if it's a choice, that we see in queer and trans rights, that we see in rights for same-sex marriage, or for even domestic partnerships, or for transition-related medical care. And she brings up this parallel to the idea that whether or not it's a choice seems really important to policymakers. And I kind of understand from a legal or a medical framework, something that you can't change about yourself is protected differently against discrimination than something that you can. But also, like, we don't have to be born this way for it to be fine. Like, it is something that potentially we could change. People have decided for many years to not pursue relationships or to pursue ways of presenting and being in the world that would make their lives better and the lives of their communities better. I spend a lot of time too thinking about that question of what does it take to earn advocacy? Because I have noticed that the further I have gotten from what my starting point was to where I needed to be in my body, in my own medical and social transition as a trans person, the easier it has gotten for people to be nice to me about it, because I pass. And I hate saying that, because it's not a thing that brings value to a trans person, but it is something that makes my life easier, and people have told me that. So they know, right? Like, people know that they have an easier time handling trans people or queer people if we comport with some level of assimilation. And that is also not what we're talking about when we're talking about liberation. We are talking about looking for a world where you do not need to be trying to assimilate, and you do not need to ever be successful in order to be known and respected as your inherently worthy self. And you know, I could choose to do all kinds of things. I could choose to monitor my food intake. I could choose to not have transitioned. I could, and I chose this, and it's important to me to say I chose it, and I could actually probably not have, and I still deserve those rights, having chosen that.
There's this great quote in the chapter where Aubrey says, in a society that stigmatizes fatness, saying that fatness is a choice implies that choosing fatness is the wrong choice, right? If there's a choice, we love a good binary in this society. So if there's a choice, there's a good choice and a bad choice, a right choice and a wrong choice. And so then we go into this, like, well, people can't choose, so we have to be nice to people because they didn't have a choice. But even if they had a choice, it turns out we should still be nice to people about who they are and what they look like and all of these things.
And it also really brings up that implication that if you did have a choice, which you so painfully and brutally don't, then obviously you would choose this other way, that obviously, you know, you would choose to not have gone through this experience. And I don't find that to be true. And so I have this sort of funky and weird intersection of those things, because like something that I've spent a lot of time thinking about over the last couple of years is how risk factors for disordered eating overlap with a lot of my personal experiences, specifically for trans people who are experiencing dysphoria about body composition, and also who are experiencing rapid changes in body composition on HRT. It is unfortunately really common to see disordered eating patterns emerge in that process. I'm vegetarian. I feel like just the pursuit of vegetarian and vegan recipes is like a disordered eating minefield on the internet that I am constantly having to draw myself out of on purpose. Like I'm essentially having to choose to not have a disordered eating pattern on a regular basis while recipe searching. And I had this experience a couple of summers ago where I lost two of my grandparents within a week of one another, the week after my wedding. It was a really messy summer, and I was obviously having a lot of trouble taking care of myself. Depression and grief are also really big risk factors for disordered eating behaviors. And I had this day where I'd just gotten off a plane coming back from my grandfather's funeral, and then I was going on vacation with some friends. And amidst that emotional whiplash, while also still trying to do some work, I needed to repack my suitcase and go back to the airport. And I was about to call the Uber, and I realized I hadn't eaten lunch. And I was going to get on a plane as soon as I got to the airport to fly from Boston to Atlanta, which is long enough that you can't make that without eating, but not long enough that they give you food. So I'm sitting here just thinking, I have to do something. I don't know what groceries are in the house. Pulled out a microwave ramen cup, made the ramen cup, threw an egg in, threw some cheese in. I was like, I need to eat as much food as possible right now because I have not eaten and I will not eat for the foreseeable next couple of hours. And I ate very quickly, and I ate to the point of discomfort. And I remember having this feeling and this thought of, this is actually also me loving my body. This is also part of my body liberation, is choosing to eat when I can, what I need to eat for the rest of my day. And when we glamorize the idea of loving your body or intuitive eating or having this wonderful, beautiful relationship with our bodies and food, we usually think about things that are always going to feel really nice and that are going to look great on Instagram. And I can tell you that my microwave ramen with an egg dissolved in it that made me bloated when I got into my Uber was none of those things. And I was so glad that I did it because my flight was delayed in the air and I was already getting hungry by the time I touched down. And that was what it looked like loving my body that day. And I knew that, and it was completely fine. And so like when I'm thinking about what this all means for liberation, I'm thinking about how uncomfortable it is physically and emotionally to do the work of liberation, especially when the site of that is our personal lives.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is often easier to, well, it's complicated, but it's often easier to project liberation out there and do it for other people. And what it means to do it for yourself, for your body, for who you are, is hard and uncomfortable and also extremely important. And so, just all of this conversation for me and Aubrey's book and this podcast, it just feels so incredibly tied to who we are as Unitarian Universalists, right? Giving people the dignity and the agency to make their own choices, if there are choices to be made, and do what is and is not helpful for themselves. And sometimes people make bad choices, and unfortunately, they still have inherent worth and dignity, and you still have to love them. That is just the reality of the world, and it is hard and it is messy. So in preparation for this, I watched a GA workshop from a couple of years ago. It's incredible. I will share it with folks. It was a pre-recorded workshop, so it's online, and it is on fat liberation, and it's led by 3 fat UU ministers. And I was just like furiously scribbling notes the entire time. But one quote that I just wanted to pull out was by Reverend Molly Brewer, who's talking about inherent worth and dignity and fatness and fat liberation. And in this section, Faye says, we know that inherent worth and dignity is not contingent on health or how someone looks or whether we find them pleasing to look at. These things do not have any effect whatsoever on a person's inherent worth and dignity. Our UU grounding for an embodied theology of fatness already exists, embedded in our principles and in our theology. So we can do a bunch of mental gymnastics to make fat liberation fit into Unitarian Universalism, or we can stop and take a look at Unitarian Universalism and say, oh, right, there it is. In the inherent worth and dignity, it covers that already. So there are just so many pieces of this, right? And I think one that's really important is that there's a way to care for each other and express love for each other and, take care of each other in ways that acknowledges that people have challenges in their lives and people make choices in their lives. And also, it is not our business. It is not our business to presume what someone can or should be doing or choosing, even the people we love. And that is extremely difficult. And it is complicated. It is complicated when we're talking about our children, right, who are in our care and also are beings, human beings with agency. One of the things that I love that Michael says in the podcast all the time is, I'm not going to stop someone from blank. I'm not going to stop someone from drinking celery juice. I'm not going to stop someone from buying things from Goop. I'm not going to stop someone from dieting or having surgery. And there are bigger societal implications that we can think about and address. And at the end of the day, it's not up for me to say, you can or cannot do this with your body. You should or should not do this with your body. Even if I think you would be healthier, I am not a doctor. And also sometimes even our doctors do not actually lean into the ways that we want to be thinking and talking about health. So it's complicated, right? And we can hold all of that complication. And especially when we're particularly passionate about something, it can be hard to rein that in a little bit. When we just know that we're right, we still can let people make their own choices and let people live their lives and love them and trust them. And that is real and true and messy and complicated.
Yeah. And I think that that's something that I struggle with having these conversations too, because it's hard to not presume that if you've now spent a bunch of time thinking about how to liberate yourself, that now oh, I know what you should do too. It becomes this cycle really, really easily of doing the work that I need for myself and then always checking in with the fact that other people are always going to need a different process from the ground up. It's something that I feel really fortunate to tap into as a skill in my work as a teacher, but it is also something that I am consistently keeping my mind on. And so I think when we're coming back to some of these questions about what are we modeling in front of one another that we heard from the reading to begin with, and what are we teaching to one another, where do we go? Where do we go with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think too about the Time for All Ages that Martha shared. I love that song so much. I discovered it on TikTok from a singer who just writes all these great songs for kids, and they're always in the back of my head. But I also was thinking, as Martha was saying, oh, this is what I'm going to do for the Time for All Ages. I was thinking, that might feel hard for some of us, right? It might feel hard to look at our kids and tell them, sometimes your belly has a lot of fat, and I love that. It may be a little easier to say when they're very small. And then as they grow, it's a little harder to hold on to that, right? To say that and mean it, and to think and talk about their bodies, and then to think and talk about our own bodies and model those conversations for them is another layer, right? And so, there's that reading that we heard at the beginning that, we sometimes think and are doing something out of love, And also it can be harmful. One example that comes to mind, we are in the season right now of Girl Scout cookies, and I have a practice to buy Girl Scout cookies from every Girl Scout I come across. Just as many cookies as possible always is my my process around Girl Scout cookies. But I've seen a lot of things going around, particularly this year, about the ways that we interact with Girl Scouts selling cookies and the things that we say to them, right? Do we say, yes, thank you, I would love to buy some cookies? Do we say, I can only buy one box because I can't have that many cookies in the house? Do we say, I'll buy these because I'm being bad today? Is that what we're modeling, right? To these girls who are learning about the world and they're learning about money, and right, like Girl Scout cookies, the lessons there are not meant to be about bodies, right? The lessons there are meant to be about selling and, you know, all these other things. And but the ways that we continue to think and talk about Girl Scout cookies, and, you know, do we buy them or do we not buy them? And you know, the ways that then when we're home, maybe we're modeling in front of the kids in our lives, you know, oh, well, I've been good today, so I can eat one cookie. And what does that look like? And what does that mean for the kids in our lives? What do they internalize? What do they learn about bodies and all of that? And so I want us to model for ourselves and for each other and for the kids in our lives that, you know, we can eat cookies and our bodies can be big and we can have fat bellies and that's all okay. And I will say, under all of that, you don't have to love your body. Like, you might not love your body. You might not love certain parts of your body. You might not love your whole body. And that's real and true. I was paging through Roxane Gay's memoir, Hunger, to see if there was a good reading in there. And I came across this and I felt like I want to talk about this. She says, it would be easy to pretend I am just fine with my body as it is. I wish I did not see my body as something for which I should apologize or provide explanation. And I know, having grown up in a culture that is generally toxic to women and constantly trying to discipline women's bodies, that it is important to resist unreasonable standards for how my body or any body should look. What I know and what I feel are two very different things. And that just feels like justice work and liberation in a nutshell, right? We're not doing fat liberation or other forms of justice work because we always deeply know deep in our bones it's what must be done. Sometimes we're doing it pushing against the messages that we have internalized in society and the ways that we personally have learned to think and talk about ourselves and other people. And we do it anyway, right? We don't do it because it's easy. We wouldn't need to do so much justice work if it was easy and natural and not a big deal, right? We're pushing against always these messages, these things that we're hearing and learning from society, and we're saying it matters anyway. In the face of that, it matters more that I think about and talk about myself in these ways. And that feels important.
Yeah, and I think that like things that we have already, you know, spent a lot of time talking about and thinking about in this community also include like a lot of these intersections that I keep bringing up with experiences of gender and experiences of body, that the more that we look around at ourselves and one another and widen this idea of what someone who uses they them pronouns looks like, widen the idea of what it means to look at your body and say, I have this gender or not. Like that, all of those things are also things that we can do in the process of looking at ourselves and those around us and widening the idea of what holy, wonderful, exceptional, and also just completely fine and none of my business bodies are. And that like the practice that we have started to do together as a community in all these other areas is something that we can leverage to also start, you know, having these thoughts. about our bodies.
Yeah, I think it's important that Soren and I are not doing this sermon because we have all the answers and we are giving them to you. We are doing this sermon. We came up with this idea because we like listening to Aubrey and Michael have these conversations, right? And they dig very deep in many weeks of research on these topics. But we don't have to do that to have the conversation. So, I hear something wild in one of these episodes and I go to Soren or I post on Facebook, like, I just learned this thing and it feels wild to me. And it made me think about this. It made me think about this way that I interact with my own body. And it made me think about this thing that I have never considered, that I have been taught implicitly in society, right? The conversation is the point, kind of, right? It's not that we're going to sit down and have the conversation and then we will magically be perfect at everything, the end, and move on with our lives. Like, there's a reason we are in community. There's a reason we have conversation. There's a reason we figure out these things together, right? We have these conversations back and forth. And so the way that we do this work is in conversation. And so Soren and I wanted to both have that conversation and model it, right, as a thing that you can do, whether it's, I have more questions about this, or I heard this thing and now I'm wondering, or this made me think about this experience that I've had and the ways that it intersects and overlaps with other pieces of who I am and my experiences in the world. Like that is what I want out of this. And also, like, secretly out of everything that we do, right, is conversations and learning and checking in and coming back to things again and again, and things kind of in the back of your head, and then it leads to something else, right? That is what we are doing. And so we wanted to have this conversation, model this conversation, and then also invite all of you into this conversation in whatever form that looks like. If it looks like reading this book, or if it looks like listening to Maintenance Phase, I will always be here to talk to you about that, like always. And if it's, digging deep into something and you're coming across some things in yourself, like, I'm here for those conversations too. And if it's just noticing things and you want to tell me you notice them, like, I'm here for all of that. Whatever interactions we have, whatever conversations come up, it feels important. Yeah. So Soren, I don't know if there's anything you want to add before we wrap up here, but
I don't think so, other than that microwave ramen is holy and I stand by that. Amen.
Amen. I will just follow that up. I am a person who likes to cook and likes to put food on Instagram. And I have to remind myself every once in a while to, like, also put the frozen breakfast burritos that I eat every morning on there. Like, that is also, like, part of how I nourish and love my body, not only the, like, things I spend forever making. And so it's helpful for me just to notice those things. Like, yes. Also, eating this breakfast burrito is also part of the work. And also eating a ton of food on my way to the airport, because who knows when I will be able to eat again. That's also this work, right? So I hope that this has brought things up and opened up questions and conversations, and that you are having those conversations with each other and with other people and me and with Soren and with all of us, with Martha and with your kids, and all of those good things I want for us about bodies and about fat liberation, and also about everything that comes up in our lives. Let's keep breaking open conversations and figuring it all out together. May it be so, beloveds.
Amen.
Hello, friends. My name is Aisha Cruz, and I am one of the co-presidents of the First Parish in Malden board. I am also here